I had just passed through the security checkpoint at the airport when I noticed a white police officer standing by the check-in counter, looking at me a little longer than at everyone else. It was that persistent, judging look that I had already grown accustomed to. Something in his expression told me that something unpleasant was about to happen. However, there was one detail he was missing. I wasn't just a passenger. I was the owner of the airline operating this flight. Every time I pass through airport security, I feel like people are weighing me with their eyes, evaluating me as if every movement, glance, or gesture is under close scrutiny. Today was no exception. I passed through the security zone and immediately noticed that the white police officer standing by the check-in counter looked at me a little longer than at others. It was a familiar look, suspicious, judging, as if he had already made up his mind. I could feel his gaze on me even as I walked a few meters away. He was still watching me like a predator stalking its prey. It was uncomfortable, but not surprising. Years of experience had taught me to stay calm, even when the world around me tried to push me off course. But today, something felt different. Inside, I sensed that this day wouldn't go as usual. I had a premonition that this glance would trigger a chain of events that would soon spiral out of control. I was flying to Chicago on business, a regular trip planned for the week. But now, standing in the middle of the airport and feeling that intense gaze, I realized that the problems would start before I even boarded the plane. My heart beat a little faster. Although I remained outwardly calm, an inner voice told me that this officer wouldn't leave me alone. He was the kind of person who acted on preconceived notions, judging by appearances, and instantly seeing a threat where there was none. But this man didn't know who he was dealing with. I wasn't just another passenger. I was the owner of the airline for the flight I was about to take. And if he started something, he would soon learn the truth. Then his confidence would crumble before my eyes. As I expected, the officer began moving toward me, his eyes never leaving me. His face remained expressionless, but I could see the determination in his eyes. He had already made up his mind and wasn't going to back down. I knew this type. He enjoyed his power and was eager to demonstrate it. He approached too closely without introducing himself. "Let me see your documents," he said bluntly with an authoritative tone. Wordlessly, I handed him my passport and ticket, keeping my calm. Around us, people began to glance over, sensing that something was happening. He examined my documents carefully, his expression growing more intense. "Where are you flying?" he asked, still fixated on my papers. "To Chicago," I replied, suppressing my irritation. "For what purpose?" He continued the interrogation, his voice growing colder. "A business trip," I answered calmly. He closed my passport and spent a few more seconds looking at me, clearly thinking about his next move. I could see that he was unsure, but his prejudice still controlled his actions. Finally, without a word, he grabbed my arm and began leading me toward his car. That was the turning point. I could have resisted, but I knew that would only make things worse. The passengers around us were now watching with even greater curiosity, but I stayed composed. Internally, I knew this was the moment for him to realize his mistake. The officer was acting as he always had, following his usual pattern. But his pattern overlooked one important detail. I wasn't who he thought I was. We reached the police car. I calmly sat in the back seat, watching as the officer opened the door to take his place behind the wheel. He was clearly confident that he was in full control of the situation. His face, his movements, all reflected the self-assurance of someone who believed he was untouchable, someone who thought he knew exactly how this would play out. But it was time to break his illusion. As he sat in the driver's seat, I leaned forward, looking at him in the rearview mirror. "Do you want to know who I am?" I asked calmly. The officer smirked, clearly not believing a word. He expected some absurd excuse, a desperate attempt to get out of the situation. "I am the owner of this airline," I said with the same calmness. His smirk quickly vanished, his face froze, and I saw his eyes widen for a brief moment in shock. It was a short moment, but it was enough to reveal his confusion. He realized he had made a huge mistake. His confidence began to crumble before my eyes like a house of cards. He no longer knew what to do. A heavy silence hung in the air, drawing both of us into its tense weight. He couldn't come up with an excuse, couldn't think of a way out of this. His prejudice had led him to this moment, but now all the power was in my hands. The action had already been set in motion, and there was no turning back for him. Sitting in the back seat of the police car, I looked at the officer in the rearview mirror. His gaze was fixed forward, but I could see the hints of worry in the corners of his eyes. He wasn't as confident as he had been a few minutes ago when he had abruptly dragged me to the car as if I was someone who needed to be stopped immediately. Now his certainty was wavering, and it showed. His jaw was tense, and his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. He avoided looking at me, as if afraid I'd notice his doubts. Inside, I felt a strange calm. At this moment, I was in full control of the situation. I could have told him right away who I really was, but I decided to give him time to realize his mistake. Let him stew in his own doubts, thinking about the consequences that awaited him. I knew that the moment would come soon, the moment when his world would collapse, when his prejudice and arrogance would be replaced by fear. Fear, and realization hit harder. For now, I let him enjoy the illusion of control. I remembered past incidents where similar situations had ended badly for me, when people like him had used their authority to make me feel worthless. There were moments when I felt complete despair, not knowing how to get out of such situations. But today was different. Today, I wasn't the person they were used to seeing. Today, I was in a position of power, and that power wasn't visible at first glance. It was hard to recognize behind my outward calm and silence. Today would be different from all the other days. When the car stopped at the police station, I felt the last remnants of anxiety inside me give way to calm and confidence. Everything was going according to plan, and I could already see how the situation would unravel for the officer. He opened the door and motioned for me to get out. I calmly followed his instructions, showing no signs of nervousness. We approached the station entrance, and he led me inside without saying a word. His silence was becoming increasingly awkward. When we entered the building, other officers glanced at me with the same suspicious looks. I noticed their gaze, a mixture of distrust and condemnation. Like this officer, they had already made up their minds. For them, I was just another offender, someone they considered a problem. They had no idea how wrong they were. I didn't need to say anything. My Harpers already knew what was happening, and I was confident they would arrive on time. This whole process, for me, was more than just a confrontation with prejudice. It was a test that I had consciously decided to go through, to show these people how wrong they could be. As I sat in the small room where they brought me, I watched the officer avoiding my gaze. He was nervous. It was obvious by the way he quickly filled out the paperwork, glancing at the clock every now and then. He wanted to wrap this up quickly, but he knew the situation was already out of his control. "How much longer?" I asked, still sitting in my chair. The officer looked up at me but said nothing. His silence spoke louder than any words. He hoped it would all end the way it always did, that I would turn out to be exactly who he thought I was. But inside, he was already beginning to doubt. I could see his confidence melting away like ice under the sun. And this was only the beginning. Time passed, and the tension in the room grew. The officer continued to avoid conversation, but I could feel his nervousness increasing with every minute. Then came the moment when I decided to deliver the first blow. I straightened up in my chair, allowing myself a slight smile. "My Harpers are already on their way," I said, breaking the silence. Those words hit him like a bolt of lightning. His face paled, and for a moment, I saw fear flash in his eyes. He realized he had made a mistake, but he hadn't yet comprehended the full extent of the disaster he had entangled himself in. His hands trembled, and he averted his gaze, burying himself in the paperwork again. But I knew his thoughts were no longer on the documents. This moment was the culmination of his downfall. He had thought he was in control, that everything was under his power. But now, with the realization of the approaching consequences, his confidence was crumbling. The officer understood that this wasn't just a mistake. It was a catastrophe, and he was on the verge of losing everything. By this time, my Harpers were already pulling up to the station. His time was up. The police officer sat at his desk across from me, trying to act as if everything was under control. But I could see how his hands were trembling. He was waiting for my Harper to arrive, and each call on his radio made him even more nervous. I remained silent, giving him the chance to realize that his career could soon collapse. I watched as he anxiously shuffled papers on his desk, avoiding eye contact with me. For him, there was still a small hope that everything would end as usual, that his actions would be justified, and I would become just another forgotten victim of his bias. But this time, things were different. This time, I wasn't the person he had assumed I was. His hands trembled more noticeably now, and the illusion of control was slipping away. He had played this game many times, always believing he would come out on top. But this time, he faced a different reality. His usual approach wasn't working. Now, instead of enjoying his power, he was waiting for the verdict. The door opened, and my Harper entered the office with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what to do. The officer tried to maintain his composure, but I saw his face turn pale for a brief moment. My Harper wasted no time on pleasantries and got straight to the point. "Can you explain why you detained my client?" His voice was calm, but there was a firm authority behind it. The officer hesitated. I could see him struggling to find the right words, but nothing came. Every action he had taken, every question he had asked earlier, now seemed absurd. The silence in the room became almost tangible, as if the air around us thickened. I was following protocol," the officer finally stammered, his voice sounding unsure. Without acknowledging the weak excuse, my Harper pressed on. "And are you aware that my client is the owner of the airline for the flight he was trying to board?" Those words hit the officer like a final blow. He froze. His face turned ashen, and he could no longer hide the fear in his eyes. This was the moment when the illusion of his authority completely shattered. He realized he had made a massive mistake, one that could cost him not only his reputation, but his entire career. His hands trembled again, and he didn't know where to look. At that moment, I could feel the fear overtaking him. His confidence had evaporated, replaced by the cold realization that there was no way out. After my Harper finished asking his questions, the officer quickly left the room, summoned by his superior. His steps were hurried, almost unsteady. I knew there was no escaping the consequences of his actions now. He understood that he would have to explain everything to his superiors, and no excuse could save him from what was coming. My Harper and I waited in the room, but I already knew how this would end. The minutes passed slowly until the door opened again. The officer came out pale and with his shoulders slumped. His face no longer carried the same confidence it once did. He could barely speak, his voice shaking as he tried to explain himself. "I've been asked to provide a full explanation," he said, looking away, avoiding eye contact with me. His career was unraveling right before our eyes. Now he would have to answer for every step he had taken, for every biased decision that led him to this moment. I knew this was the end for him, though he still hadn't fully grasped the depth of his mistake. The officer left, and my Harper and I remained sitting in silence. It wasn't just personal satisfaction for me. It was a victory over a system that had allowed people like him to abuse their power without consequences. Now everything had changed, and the consequences would be serious. The interrogation room was small and cramped, with gray walls that seemed to press in on me with their monotony. I sat at the narrow table, waiting for this farce to end. Inside, I felt a strange calm that isn't always easy to maintain in such situations. I had seen a lot and gone through similar ordeals, but today was different. Today, I was on the other side. This time, I wasn't the one being falsely accused and humiliated. Today, this would become an example for others. I recalled past incidents when prejudice had been my constant companion. In those moments, I was powerless, unsure of how to defend myself. But every such incident had taught me something, given me the strength not to give in to the pressure. Today, I was no longer that person. I knew that this time, I wouldn't be a silent victim. This time, the situation would turn against those who created it. My thoughts returned to the police officer. He thought he was in control, that he could once again use his biases as a weapon. But he was wrong. His time was up. Now it was a matter of principle. I wasn't just seeking justice for myself. I intended to show that such actions could no longer go unnoticed. All I had to do was wait. Time was on my side. The door opened, and I was invited into the police chief's office. When I entered, the officer who had detained me was already sitting there, but his confidence had clearly evaporated. His face looked tense, his hands folded on his lap as if trying to keep them from shaking. I sat across from him, observing how he struggled with his emotions. The police chief, a middle-aged man with a stern face, sat behind his large wooden desk. He glanced at me, then at his subordinate, and the atmosphere in the room felt heavy. "So, what happened here?" the chief asked coldly, glancing at the documents in front of him. The officer tried to explain, but his words sounded unconvincing. He mumbled something about suspicions, about how he acted within his authority, but each time he spoke, his words seemed weaker, more desperate. Voice grew quieter, and his eyes darted around the room as if searching for a way out of the trap he had created for himself. My Harper stood next to me, not interfering, giving the officer a chance to fully entangle himself in his own words. When he finally fell silent, the police chief sighed and looked at me. "Your Harper has already informed us who you really are, and I must say, this is a very unpleasant incident." His voice was sharp, but I could sense that he understood the gravity of the situation. "We will deal with it." The officer sharply turned to look at me, and I saw fear in his eyes. He realized there were no more excuses. His career was in danger, and it was all because of one wrong decision based on prejudice. When the conversation with the police chief ended, the officer was asked to stay for further investigation while I left the office with my Harper. But I couldn't resist glancing back. The officer sat with his head lowered, his face full of confusion and fear. He no longer looked like the confident man who, just a few hours ago, had tried to use his authority against me. I watched as the internal barrier he had built so carefully crumbled before my eyes. Now, he understood that his actions had consequences. He had destroyed his career, his future, all because of simple prejudice. Realizing this was a heavy blow for him, and I could see it. For him, this was the end. He realized that everything he had built over the years was destroyed in a single moment when he failed to overcome his stereotypes. For me, this was confirmation that a system based on prejudice must, and will, be dismantled. I sat in my office, thinking over the upcoming trial. Now that the case had been taken to court, I knew that the system would defend itself. My goal was not only to restore justice, but to make sure that this case became a precedent. My Harper said that we had every chance of winning. The evidence was undeniable and the situation was clear. But I understood that court wasn't just an arena of facts. It's a battleground of ideals where each side defends its interests. A system that supports prejudice wouldn't give up easily. I felt ready for it. For too long, people like me had suffered from injustice. For too long, similar cases had gone unnoticed or been silenced. But not this time. I had decided that I wouldn't just achieve justice for myself, but show that such behavior was unacceptable for anyone. The day before the trial, I recalled every moment of the incident. How the officer had begun to ruin his life without even realizing it. He was still trying to justify himself. But when we faced each other in court, he would have to confront the truth. On the day of the trial, I was calm. The officer sat across from me in the courtroom, his face a mixture of tension and exhaustion. He still believed that he could find an excuse for his actions. His Harpers built a defense based on protocols and suspicions, trying to justify what he had done with formal rules. But I knew that wouldn't work. The judge entered the courtroom, and we began listening to the arguments from both sides. My Harper spoke confidently about the facts. He talked about the bias that had driven the officer's actions, how this incident wasn't just an accident, but the result of a system that allowed such actions to go unpunished. I could see that the officer was trying not to look at me, his hands trembling slightly, the confidence gone from his eyes. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up, trying to talk about how he had acted within the law, but his words were hollow, lacking the certainty with which he had acted at the airport. Now, in the face of the truth, his excuses sounded like an echo in an empty room. The judge listened in silence, but I could tell from his expression that the case was already decided. The final blow came when my Harper reminded the judge that I was the owner of the airline the officer had refused to let me board. It was the final point in the argument. His bias and mistakes were clear to everyone in the room. The judge delivered his verdict quickly. He declared the officer guilty of exceeding his authority and acting with prejudice. I sat in the courtroom, watching as the officer's world completely collapsed. His face went pale, and he couldn't believe that this was really happening. At that moment, I knew his fate had been sealed from the moment he let his prejudice guide his actions. But this wasn't just my victory. It was something bigger. It was a blow to a system that had allowed people like him to act without consequence for years. This case wasn't just a personal win. It was a signal to everyone who had ever faced such injustice that they no longer had to stay silent. I left the courtroom feeling that we had begun to change not just one life, but the system as a whole. This was just the first step. I knew there was still much work ahead, but today's victory showed me that change was possible if we fight for it. After the court delivered its verdict, events began to unfold at lightning speed. The story, which had started as a simple confrontation at the airport, quickly spread across all the news outlets. The phones wouldn't stop ringing. Journalists called one after another, each wanting to interview me. They were eager to hear not only what had happened, but also what it meant for society as a whole. I sat in my office, scrolling through the headlines in the news feeds. My story had become a symbol of the fight against systemic discrimination, of how prejudiced judgments can ruin lives. But for me, this was more than just a personal victory. I knew this case would resonate not only with those who had faced similar injustice, but also with those who were yet to encounter it. Every call from a journalist reminded me that I now had to be a voice for those who couldn't defend themselves. This was more than just one case. I understood that this story could become the catalyst for change. It was important to convey to people that fighting discrimination isn't just a personal battle, but a social responsibility. I prepared for the interview, recalling every moment of this story. My goal wasn't just to recount what had happened, but to show how deeply rooted the problem of prejudice is in society, and how crucial it is to fight against it. A few days later, I started noticing the first signs of change. News reports began to emerge that police departments across the country were reassessing their methods. What had happened to me had become a wake-up call for many, both for ordinary citizens and for the system itself. I was watching TV when I saw a report that one of the major cities had begun introducing training for police officers on how to avoid racial bias. This was the first of many changes that started to be implemented after my case. On the screen, they showed officers undergoing training, and I felt that this was only the beginning. My case had sparked discussions at a high level. Politicians started raising questions about police reform, demanding stricter oversight of how law enforcement interacts with the public. This couldn't help but bring a sense of satisfaction, but I also knew that one case wasn't enough to fully change the system. However, it was an important step that showed that change was possible. My Harper called me to inform me that we had been invited to speak at a human rights conference, where I was expected to share my experience. This was an opportunity to draw even more attention to the problem. I knew that I had to use this moment to continue the fight for justice. A few weeks passed, and I learned that the officer who had detained me was no longer working at the police station. His career had been destroyed by a single decision he made based on his prejudices. This man, who once looked down on me with such confidence, had now lost everything. I thought about it with mixed feelings. It wasn't joy, but rather a sense of satisfaction that justice had been served. But I also understood that his fate was not just a punishment for one incident. It was a warning to the system that had allowed people like him to act without consequences for years. My victory showed that times were changing, and that now actions driven by bias would not go unnoticed. As I stood on the podium before journalists and politicians at the conference, I realized that my story was just one of many. But this story had opened a dialogue that many were afraid to start. I spoke about how such incidents should never happen again, about how important it is to fight racial discrimination, and how the system should be transformed, protect people, not destroy their lives. This was a new world, a new reality, but there was still much work ahead, and I was ready to continue this fight. Every morning brings a new chance. But today, I knew this day would be different. Over the past few weeks, my life had changed drastically. What had started as a simple flight to Chicago had turned into something much bigger. But it wasn't just my life that had changed. For the police officer who detained me, this morning wouldn't be an ordinary one either. His world had crumbled, and now he would have to start over from scratch, without the job or the confidence that once upheld his power. I didn't feel any schadenfreude. I didn't even feel like a winner in the usual sense of the word. My sense of satisfaction came from knowing that justice had finally been served. This case revealed what had been hidden for years behind the facade of the system, and now everyone knew about it. When I woke up this morning, memories of everything that had happened swirled in my head. Yes, my life continued, and I returned to my business. But every time I looked in the mirror, I remembered how different this day could have been if I hadn't stood up for my truth. But I couldn't let myself dwell on these thoughts for too long. An important day lay ahead. I was preparing for a new interview with the press. It was an opportunity to once again tell people why this fight was so important. When I arrived for the interview, I was greeted like a hero. Cameras flashed and reporters asked questions even before I had a chance to step out of the car. Inside, I felt like I was standing on the brink of something significant, though it still hadn't taken full shape. I walked into the studio and took my seat in front of the camera. The host smiled and began, "You've become a symbol of the fight against racial discrimination. Tell us, how do you feel now that your story has reached such a national level?" I thought for a moment. How could I answer that? I didn't see myself as a symbol. All I had wanted from the beginning was justice, but now it had grown into something much larger. For me, this is not just a personal victory, I began. This case revealed a problem that has been hidden for many years. We all need to think about how prejudice and stereotypes shape our actions and our lives. This isn't just a story about one person suffering because of another's mistake. It's a story about a system that allows such mistakes to happen. The host nodded, and we continued our conversation. I spoke about the importance of fighting discrimination not just at the legal level, but at the level of public consciousness. People need to realize that prejudice not only ruins the lives of those who are targeted by it, but also those who act on it. The interview concluded, and I felt a sense of fulfillment. My case had become a topic of national discussion. It was the start of change, but I also knew that the fight wasn't over. There was still a long way to go. When I left the studio, my Harper called me. He informed me that the police officer who detained me had officially been fired and was packing up his things at the station. Today, I decided I wanted to see it, not out of revenge or gloating. It was something I needed to do to close this chapter for myself. I arrived at the station and saw the officer who once so confidently acted against me now slowly packing his belongings into a cardboard box. He looked tired and broken, and at that moment, I realized that his life had changed forever. He was a man who once believed in his infallibility, but now he had to face the consequences of his actions. I watched him from a distance, not wanting to engage in conversation. He didn't notice me, too lost in his own thoughts, and that was the way it should be. He had faced the truth he had long ignored, and now he had to start over. This moment was the culmination not just of his story, but of mine as well. We both emerged from this situation as different people, but while this was a fall for him, it was a rise for me. Now I understood that my fight was only beginning. This story wasn't just about the two of us. It was a story about justice, about how the world changes when you're not afraid to speak the truth. And I knew that today was only the first step in a long journey toward equality.